Hello, welcome back. Today we will be exploring the Black Canadian experience. Let's get right into it. All humans are created equal. It is only humans themselves who place themselves above equality. Why is it that some experience more inequality than others? Why is it that there's inequality in this world at all? We've already covered the evolving role of women in Canadian history, and how women were treated less than men and experienced misogyny. Now it is time to cover a much broader topic, the Black Canadian experience. Let's start by seeing how the treatment of Black Canadians has changed over time. Black Canadians were kept as slaves for countless years until the Slavery Abolition Act in 1834. It gave Black Canadians the freedom they deserved, but they still were not treated as equal. Fast forward to 1850, the Common Schools Act had been placed, which meant that white people and Black Canadians had separate schools and separate timings. White people didn't want there to be Black children learning alongside their children because they believed it would compromise their education. Black people at the time were not thought of or even accepted to be human beings, which is absurd. They were socially restricted in every way possible. Black women who became nurses could only ever treat Black patients, and it got really hard for Black Canadians to get jobs or get a higher education because they were almost always the last pick and least wanted. Government stayed away from hiring many Black people because of how the white community would react, seeing how white was the visible majority at the time. They were segregated from stores, buses, movie theaters, practically any place where white people also go. The whole country was biased against Black Canadians. Even if a Black community held a protest or wanted to take action to the court, like Fred Christie's case, the judges and jury would typically be in favor of the opposing side. We can see that it wasn't just a society that was against Black Canadians. It was also the systemized and structured marginalization put in place by the government. By 1914, World War I had begun, as we learned from the Canada and the Wars videos on my channel. We also learned how the number of troops started to diminish at an alarming rate by 1915. The government used conscription and propaganda to encourage war enlistment, but that wasn't enough. Black men and all of the BIPOC community were rejected enlistment in the war, until 1915 to 1916, when Indigenous, Sikh, and Asian soldiers were accepted for enlistment. Black Canadians were also accepted, but were put into the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and their job was to create trenches, do maintenance, and much more labor work. They were not put in any combat units. The treatment of Black people changed here. They were more accepted than before and were slowly being given more freedom. In 1944, Ontario became the first province in Canada to pass the Racial Discrimination Act. This made it illegal to have discriminatory or racist public signage that included posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts as well. In the 1950s, Ontario passed two more laws favoring Black Canadians, which are the Fair Employment Practices Act and the Fair Accommodation Practices Act. This made it so that the Black Canadians had the opportunity to get jobs they previously weren't able to get, and that they couldn't be discriminated against. Courtesy of these three laws, Ontario's Human Rights Code was formed, which promised all Canadians to have equal rights and opportunities, without any discrimination or bias. This was a huge step in BIPOC history. It allowed BIPOC Canadians to be more successful and to be considered equal. Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement all started in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was shot dead. George Zimmerman shot Trayvon after calling the police about suspicious activity. He followed Trayvon and shot him. He assumed he was dangerous because he was Black. This is a really sad incident of racism that angered many people and sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. Celebrities and political figures caught wind of BLM and tried to give it as much exposure as possible to bring light to this issue in the hope to end racism. BLM started to slowly die down until the George Floyd incident. George Floyd was a black man who bought a pack of cigarettes for $20. The store employee called 911, stating it was a counterfeit note. The police showed up and pinned him to the ground, with much violence. George Floyd was pinned to the ground with a knee on his neck for 8 minutes until he died. He was murdered by a police officer who used police brutality to kill an innocent black man, just because of what he looked like. This was when many people heard about the Black Lives Matter movement. It started trending on all different social media platforms and gained tremendous amounts of exposure. It did a great deal to help remove racism and assumptions people might have on black individuals. When looking back at all of this, we can see that the treatment of BIPOC individuals is getting better and they're being less marginalized. From slavery and systemized segregation to social unacceptance, it is getting less severe, hopefully to the point that racism is non-existent. Everyone is equal. It's only up to the citizens of Canada and the entire world to accept BIPOC individuals for who they are, not who you think they are. Now let's look at the impacts that unfair experiences have had on black communities. Slavery, probably the biggest impact on black communities to date. Between the 1670s and 1830s, there were about 4,300 plus slaves in Canada. Even though this might seem like a small number, those who survived by escaping to the United States passed on the trauma to the next generation, and so on. The physical and mental trauma they went through changed how they lived their lives, and this was passed on. Many black slaves made escape attempts, and those who did would help more escape. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in America. When she escaped, she came back 13 different times to help rescue more people through the Underground Railroad. They were taken into Upper Canada or West Canada since slavery had been illegal there since the 1700s. I mentioned Fred Christie previously. Let's look back into his case. In 1936, black Canadian Fred Christie and two of his friends went to a tavern to drink beer, but the server refused to give him a beer because of the color of his skin. Christie attempted to sue the business, but in the end, it turned out it was completely legal. A staggering example of how the Canadian government had felt like they did nothing wrong with legalizing racial discrimination. Another instance of systemized discrimination. This has impacted countless others who failed to take action on legalized racism, people like Viola Desmond and Rosa Parks. They all had similar cases. Although at the time, it did little to change the government decisions, they eventually spoke to people, inspired other black Canadians who demanded the end of these discriminatory laws. After the American Revolution in the late 1700s, large groups of black settlers arrived in Nova Scotia. Racism was very present in the society, which forced the black settlers to live separately from the white communities. They lived on dirty and slum-like land, but still managed to settle and continue developing. This place was named Africville and was home to predominantly black settlers. Over time, Africville began to develop with the construction of schools, stores, churches, and making for a more civilized lifestyle. The municipal government of Halifax did not provide sewage systems, garbage disposal, and access to clean water, which took its toll on Africville as time passed. Many residents had requested that this be done on countless occasions, but no action was taken. Instead, the government had decided on relocating the residents of Africville entirely. The city wanted to tear Africville down to make space for industry and infrastructure. House owners able to provide proof of house ownership received money equal to the value of their houses, while those who couldn't just received $500. The deconstruction and reconstruction of Africville had taken many years. Destruction was finished in 1970, not too long ago. This impacted Black communities very much. A whole community was asked to pack up their bags and say goodbye to their homes. There was no advantage to this. They faced a lot of racism even in the new communities they moved into. Former residents of Africville, who had been deeply impacted by the deconstruction, felt determined to take action. They formed the Africville Genealogy Society, which asked the city to repay and make amends to those who lost their homes and went through so much suffering. This society continued to do so by taking part in protests and spreading the word. In 2010, the mayor of Halifax had finally made a public apology for the destruction of Africville. He thought that so much human suffering could be undone with one apology. Many of the former residents continued to fight for more compensation. This is one of the most impactful instances of inequitable experiences, and the impact they have had and continue to have on Black communities in Canada. When comparing the events of Black Canadians in Halifax and Africville to the treatment of Black Canadians in the present day, we can see many similarities. For starters, Black Canadians still face racism all over Canada and continue to be looked at as different. Black Canadians usually live alongside other Black Canadians, which is why we don't usually see Black Canadians in our neighborhood that often. This is similar to how Black settlers were forced to live in one section of Halifax, although the events in Halifax are intentional and much more severe. We can also see a connection between the aftermath of inequitable experiences, for example, the Africville Genealogy Society and the BLM movement. When there is an inequitable experience focused on Black communities, society does not move on with it. They take action to demand change. The Africville Genealogy Society demanded that they get recompensated for the destruction of their homes, just like the Black Lives Matter movement demanded that George Zimmerman and Derek Chauvin, the man who killed George Floyd, be punished for their heinous acts. One thing is for sure, though. The matter of treatment of Black people is improving. We can see that while there is a connection between the events of Africville and the present day, the problems are to a much lesser degree and extent today. White supremacy is the belief that white people are the superior race and should be the ones who dominate society. White privilege is the inherent advantage that a white person has in society because of their race. Anti-Black racism, on the other hand, is defined by prejudice and/or discrimination towards people of Black African descent. White supremacy is here because of white privilege and vice versa. White people have been the visible majority since the establishment of Canada, which is a very long time ago, giving white people the opportunity to label themselves as superior. As we learned, it was legal to discriminate Black people, which gave white people white privilege. They had their own stores, restaurants, movie theaters, bus seats, and so on. It was also far easier for a white man to get a job than a Black man, even if the white man is less educated and less fit for the job. This made living life as a white person easier than ever. Contrarily, anti-Black racism was very present during the 1900s. They had their own of everything, but worse. It was extraordinarily hard to get a job, especially when it's an industry dominated by white people. Let's connect all of this now and relate it to today. Nowadays, white privilege is obsolete. There is no systemized and biased marginalization of Black Canadians. There is one exception though. There can still be white privilege socially, whether that's the decision of hiring or trusting a Black or white man. It is almost impossible to remove bias entirely, and sometimes we make biased decisions without being aware of it. This is called unconscious bias. White supremacy is mostly a belief which forms inside of people, meaning it's up to them to change it. But for the most part, Canada is known for its multiculturalism, and when you live in Canada, you build that mindset. If I said that anti-black racism was also obsolete in Canada, I would be lying. There is racism and discrimination to a certain extent. It can affect and impact how black Canadians live. Cameron Davis, a high school student who attends Markville Secondary School, is a bright student who faced a lot of racism in school because of the preconceived notions that many people have on black people. These same assumptions are what caused George Zimmerman to shoot Trayvon Martin. Many people see black people and think they're dangerous, or they're not educated, or they're dirty. It's ridiculous how people can form these assumptions just by taking one glance at the person's skin color. Now let's look at social, political, and economical developments and the impact they have had on black Canadians. During times of slavery, slave owners would treat black people as non-human, giving them little to no human rights. It was common throughout Canada and America to keep slaves to make them do labor work. It wasn't only that they were racist at the time, they genuinely did not believe they were human. Black people were treated horribly and many were killed, and those who did survive had lifelong trauma, which they even passed on to the next generations, which is called intergenerational trauma. In 1834, the Slavery Abolition Act came into effect, abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire, which included Canada. This made slavery illegal, freeing all remaining slaves. This was a huge change that the British government had made, and the impact it had on black people was also huge. It allowed them to live life, and they were treated more human than ever in their lives. In the 1900s, we started to see the rise of systemized discrimination. Black people did not have many opportunities to advance in life. During World War I, black people were not allowed to enlist until soldier numbers started to diminish. Black people who did enlist were put into the No. 2 Construction Battalion, in which they mostly built and fixed things. They were segregated from the actual combat units. Black Canadians felt a higher sense of privilege seeing how they got to the point where they played a role in the Canadian Army. In 1915, it was made illegal to refuse enlistment due to race, but it did not sit well with the white men who were enlisting or already enlisted, because they did not want to fight alongside BIPOC men. The government then decided to segregate black men by creating a separate unit just for black men. This is called the No. 2 Construction Battalion. In 1940 to 1950, 3 acts that put an end to legal discrimination were passed: the Racial Discrimination Act, the Fair Employment Practices Act, and the Fair Accommodation Practices Act. This was life-changing. Black men were more accepted into society, mostly because of the laws, but also because more people realized that everyone is made equally. This also made it far easier for black men to get jobs, which in turn accounted for a rise in economic growth in Canada. Now let's look at successful and unsuccessful protests that promote fair treatment for black Canadians. In 1946, Viola Desmond refused to leave a cinema's white-only section. When she bought a ticket for the movies, she asked the ticket taker for the main floor, but he said that the main floor is only for white people, and that the black people sit on the upstairs seats. Viola ignored him and sat on the main floor anyway. The police dragged her out of the movie theater. The day after, she had been brought to court and charged. She was fined $26, which today would equal around $300+. The Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colored People raised money to fight Viola's case. And Carrie Best, founder of the newspaper Clarion, which was also intrigued because she had a similar experience in the same theater a few years before. Viola's story was covered on the front page of the Clarion. Decades after Viola died, her story began to receive a huge amount of public attention, courtesy of her sister Wanda Robson, who shared her story. In 2010, Nova Scotia's governor made a public apology and said that he will reinforce their stance that discrimination and hate will not be tolerated. Her story got so much exposure, in fact, that in 2016, Viola was chosen as the first Canadian woman to appear on a Canadian bill, the $10 bill. This advocacy action was very successful in spreading awareness. Viola Desmond's inequitable experience had created a movement against racial inequality and spoke to millions. George Floyd's case caused a second wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd after Floyd was accused of paying with a counterfeit bill. Protests all over America were held, mostly silent protests, with thousands of people lying on the ground just like Floyd had been before he died. Alongside protests, there was a boom in media awareness. The George Floyd movement and #BLM had been used tens of millions of times, and it had been trending dozens of times on all sorts of social media platforms. The public demanded that Derek Chauvin be sentenced to jail time, and that's exactly what happened. In June of 2021, Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years of jail time. When comparing this protest advocacy action movement to others in the past, we can notice that a lot more people are taking part in them. In previous movements, the majority of protesters would be black, while George Floyd's movement had much more diverse people protesting. An example of an unsuccessful advocacy action would be Fred Christie's case. He had sued the York Tavern for not serving him beer because of his race. He lost 2 appeals in court and lost the case in the Supreme Court of Canada in a 4-1 decision. The Supreme Court of Canada recognized that the tavern refused to serve Fred Christie and concluded that the merchants are free to serve who they want, and what they did was within the law. A lower court, however, sided with Christie and awarded him a small sum of money. This case did not have that much public awareness and exposure and didn't lead anywhere that would impact racial justice in any way. BIPOC communities in Canada were identified as a visible minority and as inferior during the 18 to 1900s. Asian men who immigrated to Canada came to find work. Thousands of Chinese men had built the Canadian Pacific Railroad, for example. The Kamagata Maru was a Japanese ship that transported many Indian men to Canada. They also came to Canada to work, most of which worked in lumber mills and mines and other labor-intensive jobs. Several Sikhs also enlisted in the army during World War I and World War II, contributing greatly to the war effort. Nowadays, Canadian BIPOC individuals don't identify themselves as workers or slaves or as a visible minority. They identify themselves as Canadian, as a citizen of the country, equal to every and anyone in the country. With the immigration of Asians and Indians to Canada over the years, a strong culture and heritage has been created, mostly present in British Columbia and Ontario. When they first immigrated, they tried to fit in with the rest of the population, transitioning to becoming a true Canadian. But over the years, culture and heritage have been built up. Black communities have been formed with churches, as well as Indian religious temples and Asian religious temples. This in combination is what makes Canada the most multiculturally diverse and culture-rich country. I believe that the most defining moment for the Black Canadian community was when Canada passed the Racial Discrimination Act, the Fair Employment Practices Act, and the Fair Accommodation Practices Act. This is because it completely changed the way that the community could treat black people. It made legal and systemized discrimination illegal. It was what black Canadians needed to be considered equal governmentally. It definitely had a lasting positive impact on the black Canadian community because it made it so that it was legal for people to discriminate against black people, treat them lesser than white people, and give them equal opportunity to get hired for jobs. It even helped the country socially and economically. This is because it allowed more black Canadians to get jobs, especially those with higher status, which would contribute to the economy even more.